Thank you so much for joining the call. I am going to take the bold assumption that everyone here is probably trying to figure out what career pathing and what transparent pay banding can look like, given the fact that our employees these days are asking for more and more transparency around these things. So we will have a bit of a common problem to solve. So I'm going to take you through, for the most part of this session, I'm going to take you through a case study of the company that I'm at the moment and our approach. And then I'm going to have some space for some questions at the end as well. And I'm going to try and do it in the format that hopefully most of you are familiar with. Maybe you're using it in your day-to-day, which is everything that we've learned from the Agile HR program. So I'm going to talk to you about what's called progression at Threads today, which is our approach to progression and to part of that sort of transparency around reward. So I will do a quick introduction to myself. I'm Kate Rand. I am one of the trainers for the Agile HR community. I've been part of the Agile HR community now for 3-4 years. I always get a bit wavy about whether it's 3 or 4. And I run the some of the Agile HR training that we do. So I do some of the public programs and then I run some of the in-house as well. I'm also the Chief People Officer at a company called Threads Styling, which is the case study that I'm going to take you through today. Now, what's interesting about Threads is that they are a scale-up and they are firmly in the fashion tech space, which means that they are half tech, half fashion, and a very challenging sandbox to play around with when it comes to people experience, because those two groups of people have very different cultures. And then also doing my master's in psychology, because I think that that's the way that the people profession is going. And I find it works really well with the Agile HR principles, because this idea of thinking like a scientist and being evidence-based is all that we're about with psychology. So being really comfortable with experimentation, understanding how to set up good experiments, and understanding how to use statistics and things like that, it actually lends itself incredibly well to being a solid Agile HR practitioner and coach. So the three kind of combine together. And what it means is that I get to test out some really cool things at Threads, and then I get to come and share them at the Agile HR community. And previously I've done one around flexible working and the fact that we did a design sprint around that and our solution for it. So now I'm back with our Agile approach to reward. Let me give you a bit of an introduction to Threads. So as I say, Threads is a scale up. It's an international business. It's focused around personal shopping. And it's this idea that you build super shoppers through the data platform that sits behind the shopper itself. So it takes all the information that we get from shoppers' phones, and it creates algorithms to figure out the best things that you can recommend, and you're going to get conversion for shoppers and the things that we can have the highest margin on and all the rest of it. So it's quite complex. It's also in its prototype phase. And from an employee perspective, we are international as well, and our employees really do mirror the organization that we're within. So they are social first. They are pretty much spread across the world, as you can see here from the global audience side of it. And they are the sort of people who very rarely, they will not check their email. They're not comfortable with sort of very basic HR things. Things have to be very visual for them. And when we talk about the modern employee, I think this really does sum up the Threads employees that we've got. So transparency is really important for them. They want things immediately. So when it comes to things like progression, a lot of the feedback that we've been dealing with at the start has been, when am I going to be able to progress? How can I track my own career pathways? When's my next salary review going to be? And some research that we found from the US was that when people have a job, when they first get their job in places like San Francisco, they expect some kind of material increase or progression to their role within 9 months, which feels crazy to some people who have been in their jobs for a very long time. And the fact that, that there is actually an amount of time it takes you to build skills up. But what that means from a progression perspective is that they expect to be able to actually track their progression through. So there's like a need to almost gamify it, which is challenging in a business like Threads, because we have a very flat hierarchy, because we're quite a modern organization and we are only 300 people. There's only so much hierarchy you can build into a business like that. So starting to get a feel for the business challenge that we were dealing with there. And then the second part of that is actually our EVP. So what I'm building up here is so you understand the business context and then the challenge within which we were trying to figure out this reward conundrum. So the employee value proposition for Threads is built around the fact that if you come to the business, you will accelerate your career in that 1 year, in all the things that you would have done that would have taken 3 years somewhere else. So we're making a big commitment to people there. And it makes us one of the employers or the employer of choice in the fashion tech space, because a lot of the other competitors that we have, they're quite large, they're quite clunky, and they really are quite rigid about their things like career progression. So people choose us, they're on our wait list, they're waiting for jobs to appear so that they can come over and work for us. But what that means is that they want to see the progression within that period of time. So this all started sort of December last year when we ran our quarterly EMPS survey. And for the second time round, we were hearing from people that progression, lack of transparency around progression, and the disappointing conversations with their managers were causing quite a lot of frustration for the employees. And they'd come out of their most recent performance reviews and they really felt that they weren't actually getting the acceleration that they needed. And given that that was one of the reasons we were asking them to come to the business, we felt that we really needed to try and do something about that. Now, going out to the business and saying at that time, we're just going to make everyone's pay transparent, and we're going to have career paths from tomorrow, is obviously not possible. So we really had to think about how we were going to do this in a way where it didn't feel scary for the managers, and it wasn't going to take us months and months and months to try and get something out, because people wanted to see something within the next couple of weeks. So that was the challenge we were trying to deal with, which is how do we make the career pathing transparent, but how do we make it authentic for the business, because we can't add a load of layers in. And from a pay perspective, we could see within the market that we were getting a lot of candidates coming through whose pay expectations were much higher than we were able to pay. So the other challenge we were facing is, well, how do we make sure up front they are either self-selecting out or they're aware up front of what we're able to offer, and that's going to make a big difference for us as well. So that was the other thing that we were trying to deal with. Constraints-wise, from a business perspective, we have very limited budget. So from a benchmarking perspective, up until this point, we've benchmarked everything ourselves. We didn't have the cash to spend on a Mercer or sort of a pay scale or anything like that. And I don't think many small organizations do. If they have to do that, it's by force, because they don't have any other choices. We needed, anything we put together had to cover all locations, because we're in the US, the UK, and Portugal. We needed the managers to buy in, because they had to sign off their career paths for their teams, and then they had to see get the teams to be on board with the career paths as well. And then we needed it to be publicly available, because we wanted a solution that was going to be authentic and transparent internally and externally. We needed it to be visual, because up until this point, we'd had some spreadsheets that were helping with things like benchmarking and stuff like that. The adoption rates were very low, because the business just isn't set up for people to want to use spreadsheets. Like I say, they are on their phones all the time. They're social first. Their job is on social media. The job is not in a spreadsheet. So I really needed something that was going to capture them. And then the definition of done for us was that we had all of the roles up to the head of level have some kind of benchmarked salary by the end of this, that the leadership competencies that we had were going to be built into all of the management roles, because we wanted to make sure that it was linked up to the other bits that we were doing around performance. And then by the end of this year, we want the pathways to be linked up to the review process. So we really took that prototype mentality and we said, okay, if we separate from everything else the idea of this career path, what's the smallest or minimum viable product that we could get out there to test to see if this is actually going to be something that people want, if they're going to adopt this product. So we didn't try and integrate it into the review process. We didn't try and integrate it into anything else that we were running at the time. We didn't even put in the benchmarks to start with. We really just brought it right down and said, okay, what's the most basic version of transparent career path that we could do? And we even talked about actually just publishing the Google Drive with everyone's role profiles in, because that felt like at least one step, which was quite basic, which was to look, you've got access to all the jobs that we have in the business. But we decided that that was a minimum viable product and we needed a minimum lovable product because they probably wouldn't actually go into the Google Drive. So that wasn't going to help us with the definition of done. So why bother? Why bother doing this? And there was some value that we did pull out, although we did say at the start, from a HR perspective, we're seeing from the feedback that we're getting that transparency is important and career progression is important to our people. We know from the EVP perspective it's important. At this stage, it's difficult to really quantify what that business value is going to be. So what we're asking for is the space to experiment and see if this makes a difference. So we're really in that sort of experimentation zone at the moment. That being said, we could see that by having pay bandings up, for instance, on job adverts, it was going to drive efficiency in things like the recruitment team. And given that we're a growth business, we're hiring 50 people every quarter, we need as much efficiency as possible in that team because we don't have a ton of money just to have recruiters sat around. So that was going to be a big win for us. It also meant that from a quota carrying role perspective, we could reposition that resource and put it into those roles, because every quota carrying role in theory brings you more revenue, and actually that is necessary for a growth business because it's the top line revenue that we're really looking for. We thought that we would be freeing up management time by doing this, because if you have an accessible career pathway that everyone can look at, they can track their own development, and they've got access to the benchmarks and things like that, you are removing that additional layer of having to go to a manager and ask them to talk to you about it. So that was important for us too, because again, in a growth business, this is probably quite contextual to Threads, managers have another job to do. They're not managers. Unfortunately, the management is an afterthought. It's not the job. So the more time you can free up from some of these things, the better. And then it also provided us with we wanted it to provide us with a real-term savings, because as when you're in a growth business, as you start to build that brand awareness, people come to you because they want the job. So they need less enticing when it comes to salary. But when you're in that sort of slightly earlier stage and you have less brand awareness, you're really at the mercy of anyone who applies to your job, because you get less candidates, you can be less picky, you don't have the transparency around the banding. So you end up paying higher salaries because you just have to take who comes in. You don't have a choice, or you have to go to an agency, and you always pay more if you go through an agency. So we were at that point now where we were an employer of choice. People wanted to come and work for us, but we were still having to sift through and get these people who had the higher salaries. So by putting this out up front, there's still good candidates who are within the benchmark because we trust our benchmarks, but it's about making sure that those are the ones that we're taking through the process. So we saw the recalibration of salaries, and we thought that would be a good piece of business value. From the end customer perspective, again, internal mobility means that you're keeping in that knowledge retention. And we've got some great examples actually of shoppers moving across the business to different departments. We've got one that became an editor, and they're taking all of that knowledge with them over to the other teams. And those are the success stories for us from this, because we're keeping them within the business. And then from the employee perspective, hopefully you're going to be able to increase the tenure within the organization. You get the more satisfaction, and the transparency of kind of what success is, and understanding how other people have been successful helps you to then replicate that skill set. So lots of value that we felt was going to come out of this, in addition to the fact that we knew that it was probably the right thing to do. So we put together a small vision as a team. It wasn't particularly ambitious, but it was something that we said in December we really wanted to do at the start of this new financial year that came up. So we wanted to try and provide transparency for current and future employees on progression. So notice here that we haven't focused on performance. We actually haven't called it reward. I know it falls under the reward bucket, but when I looked at Threads and I looked at the challenges that we were facing, we are a business that's in a phase that it doesn't need further rigor around its reward process. It has a reasonable reward process. Then we have a reward philosophy. It works fine. It doesn't need overhauling. The performance review process doesn't need overhauling. It does the job. I have 6% underperformers, they get managed out, everybody else gets managed up, that's fine. But the niche was progression. And when I talk to other heads of people and people directors who are working with these founders, one of the mistakes that they will often make is they will say, oh, we need to build a reward structure for scale. We need to overhaul the performance review system or performance management. My response back is, well, what value is that adding right now? Does it need changing? Do you even need it? Because in a business of 300 people, if the challenge is the progression side of things, then that's what you need to focus on. So just be wary of falling into those traditional HR buckets when you're trying to fix problems, certainly in smaller organizations. Listen to the data that you've got. So the other part of it for us was people seeing what it took to be successful, because, you praise in public, you critique in private. If there was some way that we could make a massive song and dance about the people that were getting promoted, then that fits in with that EVP and people know what behaviors to replicate. So it was big for us. So what we put together was this product called Progression at Threads. And the features, which I'll talk about the release cadence in a bit, included things like transparent career pathways, benchmarks accessible internally and externally. And then we did a monthly promotion comms as well, which we did across all social channels. So again, internally and externally. And actually the release cycle is probably the bit that most of you will be interested in, because it's the release cycle that's done in increments, which is how you de-risk and you get over some of those probably bigger blockers that you would get if you were about to walk into an exec team and say, we're going transparent. And I suspect that is some of the challenges that some of you are facing. So I'm going to talk a bit about the product, and then I'm going to take you through the release cycle. We hunted around a bit and we found what's called the Progression app. Oh, it was already called Progression. We'd already taken Progression. We were like, fine, they'll both be Progression. And it's an app that is mobile responsive. You can pay for a number of seats, and they've effectively taken that spreadsheet model and they've built it into something that's actually user friendly, and it's very cheap. And that was one of the constraints that we had. So what you can see here is an example of what the public view looks like. So anyone within the company can have this link, any candidate can have this link, and currently we have 7 teams live on here. And if you click on a team, it will take you in, and then you can see the different levels that you've got. And what you will also see on these is the salary band. So this is what we ended up putting together. This was the core sort of bulk of the product, and we released this incrementally across the departments. There were some further features that we did, one of them which is in here, which I'll come back to in a minute. The other 2 things that we did is we did some communication around it. So I said about making sure that everybody understood what was going on. So we're always big on data. This was our introduction to the career paths that went out, and this is actually the click map from MailChimp, so you can see kind of who's clicking on what buttons, which helps you figure out kind of where to place them and things like that. And we can see the interest that's coming in from it. So out of 267 recipients, we had 189 open it, which is pretty good. They actually opened it 476 times, so people going back, which is great. So it's got stickiness. And then they were clicking through on the links. So this shows us that we did get it right with career paths. We launched it. This is really what people wanted. They were hungry for it. So we had engagement, but not necessarily adoption at this point, because they're engaging with the product. And we also had our Progression at Threads monthly mail out that goes out, which again had an open rate of 80%. So again, we knew that people were engaging with this, and we replicated this this newsletter as a social post and also as a LinkedIn post as well, which I can show you here. So we can see that we, even externally, we're getting some engagement with it, which is great, because it's a tool to show people that people can progress within Threads. If you can see yourself here, you can see yourself here, because everybody at some point is probably going to have some kind of progression or level up if you're a shopper. And then we also used it to spotlight people within the team on our own internal Instagram too. So lots of ways to push the engagement and to increase the opportunity to see what good looks like and to understand how different teams operate together. And then the final part, which is something that we are testing again at the moment, is what's called the career conversation. So controversially, we've removed the career conversation from the manager. So they have a performance review and they set their objectives, that's fine. But what we have learned over the past 12 months is that the managers, with all the training and all the will in the world, are they're not landing that tone correctly for that career conversation. And given that it's part of our EVP, that you get to have that progression, we want to make sure that conversation feels good. So now the people team own that career conversation. And one of the tools that progression has is the ability to compare roles. That's a very expensive part of the tool. So we only have 4 seats for that, because in the true kind of figuring out where the value is and whether or not you need to launch something across a business or if you can do a smaller test, we said, well, what happens if we just give 4 seats out and we push the career conversations out, and they start to have them, let's see what the traction is. And it's worked very well. So 4 seats, I say very expensive, they are £10 a month instead of the £1 it is for the other bit. I think we spend a total of £80 a month on progression. It means that you have a conversation with someone who is best placed to talk to you about your career, because they're not trying to land grab. They understand how a role is made up. They understand how progression works. And through that, we've been able to promote and move people across the business. It's been really successful. And we can also catch in those moments people's misunderstanding about how salary works within a scale up, because one of the other things that we had noticed over the last year or so is the lack of commercial understanding across the business. So you don't get a salary increase because inflation has gone up. You get a salary increase because the business is performing well and you have leveled up. And in a growth business, if you have leveled up but the business is not performing, you don't get an increase, and that's unfortunate, but you chose to work in a growth business. So those sorts of conversations we're catching in these career discussions, and that's really important to us because people need to know what they're working for. And I think that's a level of transparency that people shy away from, because if it's not right for people, they need to be aware of what they're in and they need to move on and find something else. So let me talk about the release cycle, because I think this is important, but also quite simple. So we ran 2 sets of releases concurrently. We had the career pathing, which we kicked off from February. And then a month later, we kicked off benchmarking, and we mirrored. So the people team had the first career path, and then a month later, the people team had the first benchmark. And we kept working through like that. So there's always a month that you could do the benchmarks in. So you had a month to get used to the career paths, and then you had the benchmarks that would come next. And staying true to our sort of release cycle, we said that there were 2 points where we paused. One because we did a reorg of one of the departments, and the other because we had an investment process happening, which meant that we just had to all pause what we were doing and work on something else. We communicated that to the business, and then we picked it back up again afterwards. But it meant in this way that the moment we said to people we're going to get progression out, we were launching career paths. Straight away, we had something out there every week. They had something new to look at across the business. And then the pay bands came a month later. And we chipped the pay bands down to such a small slice that we were able to get the managers very comfortable with it. Because if I said to you, let's launch transparent pay bands for a business, you probably feel a bit sick inside. But if I say to you, why don't we do transparent pay bands for the people coordinators in the people team? You're like, that's totally manageable. Let me just get the bands out and let's find out who is or isn't in the band. Let's have an individual conversation if we need to. If there's no contention, we can just get it published. So through this, it is normal, and it's also normal in the NHS and any public services. But for private businesses, it is not normal. And there is quite a lot of pushback, normally from managers. So it's about getting them comfortable with it. And one of the challenges you have is that the legacy part. So it's fine to switch on pay bands from tomorrow if you're comfortable with them, But what do you do with everybody up until that point that maybe doesn't fit into that pay band? Well, that's the challenge. So it's about breaking it down where that elephant becomes manageable, and you're dealing with one person who's an outlier in a team rather than 50 people that are outliers across the business. So by breaking down the pay bandings in that way, we've been able to get them approved. We put them in front of the team before we put them anywhere else. We've had some of those more challenging conversations with people where they said, well, you know, I want to be paid more. Why am I not paid more in this band? And that, again, we see as an opportunity to have a career conversation with them so they understand. So it's all come from a place of positivity where it's about, you know, you want the best, we want the best for you. Let's have an honest conversation, and let's use these tools so that you're empowered to talk about the skills you've got, and your manager is empowered, and your career coach is empowered to also say to you, well, these are some of the gaps that you've got, and this is maybe why you're not the pay band that you need to be at or you want to be at. So that's how we see it. The tools are there to empower people. All right, so that was my whistle stop tour through that. I'm going to pause now and just ask if anyone's got any questions. I imagine there's lots of questions.
We are going through a very similar process at the moment. I didn't realize we were being agile, to be honest. I think we've just fallen into it by accident. We had a whole sort of reward review taken place latter part of last year, which we weren't able to implement this year due to the cost of living increases, the inflation, general economic crisis across the globe. We can't justify implementing it right now in its entirety. So what we've done is we've broken it down and looked at how we job evaluate, and looked at the different levels in each role and the level of complexities it builds up. And actually we were thinking about introducing this minimal, as I'm now going to call it, lovable product, which is looking at that tool first and then attaching it to pay later when we can actually afford to do it. So this has been really interesting. So thank you. I feel like actually we're on the right path because I was starting to doubt myself.
I think that's the trick, you know, break it down until you can do something and just keep going, because there is always a yes in it, and provided you know the value of it. It's if it feels unmanageable, it's just because it's too big.
No, thank you. It's been very helpful.
No worries. All right, Malini.
Hi, I had a question regarding the part where you mentioned that, you know, you found that managers were not really well suited to have those like career discussions, so you moved it to the people team. So whereas in my organization, we are looking at more, you know, line manager empowerment and moving away work from HRBPs to line managers, you know, where they can. And we are looking at constantly like supporting and guiding managers and, you know, questioning that, if not, why are they not at that maturity level that they can support? So yeah, would just be interested to know, like, you know, where these thoughts came from and what kind of challenges were you facing when you wanted to introduce it to managers first?
So I have very strong opinions about managers versus coaches within businesses. And the last couple of businesses I've been in have been organizations where the people who are managers are also doers. They've got a lot of work that they need to do. I'm not saying it's right, but it is the way it is. And they have been put in those management positions, often not because they want to do the management, but because they just got promoted. They were there at the right time, and now they've got this big team. So there is an element of coaching that goes with that. But there's also the point where you say, well, hang on a minute, who can really land this conversation well, and who can really coach someone through this? And the answer is the people function, because this is everything that they know and love. So if someone really isn't comfortable doing that conversation, or you know that it's just not part of what they're going to be good at, why force it? And I think this is one of those ones where I have a view that works for the organizations that I'm in. It doesn't work for everyone, but I'm sort of like, just because we think managers should be good at that, if they're not good at it and it's actually not a priority for the business, then why force them to do it when someone else can do it better?
Yeah, looking for different perspectives, because obviously there is no like right or wrong answer in black and white. I think what works for the organization and what level of maturity we are each in, I guess that matters as well. Yeah.
Well, for instance, the previous company I was at, the UX design director would be billed out on work 70% of the time. So you can't tell me that 30% that he's got left, he's going to be able to give all of that thought and the planning that comes with really providing some of the pastoral care they need to be mentored and look after things like their development and all the rest of it. So it's about, when you're in those situations, saying, okay, well, what's going to be right for the employee experience? Well, it's not hoping for the best in that 30% of time that they're going to get everything they need. It's about providing a set of tools that is actually going to help those employees develop.
So thank you very much for the presentation. Very exciting. I was also intrigued by what you said about the managers, because my background is in large corporations, global ones, you know, big business units where the P&L leader is sitting on a budget, making decisions about the salaries, of course, with the salary bands and all that, you know, helping IP, whatever position evaluation, etc. And I could see the opposite maybe happening there, where I could see that people, professionals and HR professionals would not be equipped to actually have that career conversation around, you know, sitting down with an engineer that has their deep knowledge somewhere, and to be able to have the conversation about their career and their development and what is expected from them, compared with a leader that has that skill and competence and capability themselves as well. Does that make any sense? So it might be a thing for smaller companies where the growth is so quick and you've got this. What are your thoughts, Kate, there?
So I think that's the difference between mentorship and coaching, because mentorship absolutely has to happen in the flow of work, and certainly in the size business I'm in, it has to happen from the expert, which is normally the manager. But coaching doesn't, and career coaching is about understanding how you can position yourself for the next level, understanding how you can build your own PDP, how you can understand kind of how to negotiate that benchmark conversation, the compensation conversation. So I think they're two separate things. But you're right, it is more of that. I mean, I work with only really scale ups, so it's right for them. I don't necessarily think it's right for everyone.
But I see the same kind of problematics, of course, with managers in these organizations. They've got too much work to do to be doing that coaching, career support, growth kind of support in a very good way. It's kind of something you do on the side in addition to your job. So yeah, very good conversation. Thank you very much, Kate.
Okay, thanks. This is really interesting. One question I had, so we're kind of going through a similar process and kind of getting the growth maps, we call them in our organization, up and running. It was like it's been one of these projects that's been ongoing forever, and I think people always are asking like when this is going to happen. I really like the way that your organization looked at like splitting them out into like smaller deliverables. Something that I would be really interested to know is, I mean, how did you guys like organize around getting this work up and running and delivered? Did you have like a smaller separate team within the people side that looked at getting it done, or did everyone kind of like jump in? Like, how did you split that, as well as, you know, the usual kind of BAU work as well?
So you'll see this list here that says owner of banding. I've got 2.5 people partners, and they've each got a section of the business. So it was just on them to deliver it. So they chose the dates. So fully empowered with them. I said, look, ideas once a week. They chose the dates that they could deliver on, and they put the notes next to it. And they just had to run it along BAU, which is the reason why when we did the investment process, we paused, because it wasn't just our team that was like inundated with work, it was everyone. So we just communicated those moments where we're like, okay, right, it's too much to do now. And when we did a big redundancy in one of the teams, and we then again we put a note out and said we're going to pause, partly out of respect, partly out of the fact that we were all doing a redundancy process.
Cool, thank you.
But I think the important thing is letting them set the dates. That's the bit. So as we've gone through this, they've just kept this is like a working sheet. They've just kept this up to date so that I can go in and see when stuff's coming out.
Hi, thank you, Kate. Thanks for sharing that. It's really, really interesting for me. It's the first time I'm attending an Agile HR session, so yeah, going to sign up for more. My question that I had though was, again, around career convos and the performance management piece. And I completely get what you're saying about it, the need to be split, and the fact that, you know, HR is best placed to have those career discussions. What I wondered though is, what does how do you end up closing the loop? Because obviously, if there's is there any transparency with the current manager of that individual when those career conversations take place? I guess what I'm trying to say is, does it ever come as a surprise to that manager, or how do you guys close the loop to make sure that the manager's aware of the individual's aspirations and, where possible, can support them in the sense of, you know, if it's breadth of knowledge or developing other skills, and how that piece works?
So the way that we position them with the employee is, we're there to help them position it to their manager, because we want to get to a point where everyone in Threads is able to hold their own, and that means that the employee can have an upfront discussion about their progression without losing it, and talk about their salary, and the manager could also have that conversation without saying the wrong thing, and they can talk about salary kind of openly. So since we've done this, we've had a few good examples where they've gone in for a career conversation, and we've given them the tools to go and negotiate with the manager and have the conversation. And then we've also done a bit of backdooring to the manager and said, okay, this is what's coming, so that then they have a really good moment. So they learn from the moment, then we can move on. But it's always done from the empowerment of the person reaching out to us first.
Yes.
These are your tools, off you go.
Lovely. Thank you. Makes sense. Thanks so much.
No worries.
Kate, I got one more. What are you seeing when you're starting to hire and recruit people, when these are now opened up? How are the conversations in those hiring situations? Can you share a little bit around that?
Yeah, so the pay bandings have been really helpful, because we've seen the salary expectations fall in line with them, which in itself has meant that there's less kind of redundant applications coming through. And then when we've got closer to the offer stage and we're making that offer, we're not getting the rejection. We're not getting the kind of, oh, it doesn't meet my salary expectations. So it's been really helpful from that perspective. And I think from a hiring manager confidence perspective, it's helped us reiterate to them that you don't need to pay over the odds for people. And often when you are paying over the odds for people, it's because they're too senior for the role. So it's about helping them understand that, you know, that there are good people out there and they don't have to pay over the odds, which has been really, really helpful, because we did used to have quite a lot of back and forth with managers where they're saying, you know, I need a really senior person, they're going to cost 3 times the amount of money that you've benchmarked it. And we would say, well, I don't think they're going to work out. I think it's going to be too senior a role for them. And then they would have to leave because it was too senior a role for them. So from a informal perspective, that's the other part that we've had back from it, which is the manager's confidence in the candidates coming through. I will actually put the link for the progression app as well. I rave about this app because I think my final thing that I will say is it doesn't need to be expensive to do these things. And I think there's a lot of tech out there, and what quite a lot of HR leaders are having to do now is to be the product strategist for your department when it comes to finding third-party solutions that you can use. And we get conned into this idea that we have to spend a lot of money on them, and we don't. So the 2 tools that have been just amazing for this, one is the progression that I showed you, which they're a small company. I think they're going through investment themselves. So it's a good time to get in with them now, because they're quite malleable with their roadmap. And it's not, you don't get tired or anything like that. And then the other one that we use actually for benchmarking, because we hadn't got a UK benchmark, we had a US benchmark and a Porto benchmark, is a company called Kroner, who provides for £1,000 a year, provide you with access to a range of benchmarks which cover pretty much every type of business, and they do it by revenue, size and sector, which is obviously what you want. So Kroner, if anyone's in the market for a very reasonably priced benchmarking tool for their UK businesses, and what they put together, the sheet at the end compares all of the benefits and things that people would get as well. And that's been really helpful for us. That's reduced a huge amount of time that we were putting into manually benchmarking all of our roles, which is what we've done up until December last year. So other than that, I think we're pretty much done.